I remember the sound first. It was not the crash of boots on the hallway or the usual hum of the bass at night. It was the quiet click of the command office door locking behind me. I had been staring at the blue glow of the monitor finishing the after-action reports when the overhead fluorescent light flickered once. Then I heard breathing that was not mine. The air shifted. My body froze the way it had learned to long ago. I turned slowly and saw him standing near the door. Richard Kane, my stepfather. His shoulders hunched forward, hands buried in the pockets of his jacket like he owned the room. The base visitor pass hung from his collar. My mind registered everything in seconds. Civilian, family, authorized for after-hours entry through the sponsor program. I had given that sponsor authorization to my mother. That was my first mistake. He grinned the way he used to when I was a teenager cornered in my own kitchen. There was a smell of bourbon in the air, heavy and sour. His eyes were red. I forced myself to stay calm. This was the command office, not some back alley. I was 31 years old, a staff sergeant. I had authority here. But he knew something. He knew tonight the office was empty. He leaned against the door like the hallway outside belonged to him. "Nobody's coming, Sloan. No one ever does." His voice cracked through the quiet like a blade. My lungs tightened. The fluorescent light hummed above us. My chair squeaked against the tile as I stood. The distance between us was no more than 15 feet. I saw the way his fingers brushed his belt buckle. Slow, deliberate. My training told me to calculate exits. Door blocked. Panic button under the desk. Camera on the shelf. I had placed it there 3 days earlier because somewhere deep down I knew. He stepped closer. The smell of alcohol grew thicker. My heartbeat pounded against the inside of my throat. I kept my voice steady. "You need to leave. Now." He laughed, not loud. Just that sharp, intimate laugh he used whenever he wanted me to remember who used to hold all the power. The first touch came fast. His hand gripped my wrist and pulled it behind my back. The edge of the desk pressed into my ribs. My mind split into two halves. One screaming with panic. One repeating the checklist I had written inside my head. Do not fight blind. Document. Survive. I felt the cool metal of the belt slide against my skin before the leather wrapped around my neck. I had felt fear before on deployment. Fear on a convoy when an IED threat pulsed through the radio. But this was different. This fear had a face I had known since I was 9 years old. He whispered close to my ear. Die quietly. The words did not need to be shouted. They settled in the air like a death sentence. My vision narrowed. The fluorescent light above blurred into a long, white line. My lungs fought against the tightening pressure. The belt cut into my skin as my pulse screamed. I clawed at his hands, but he pressed harder. My heel struck the edge of the filing cabinet. No help, no footsteps, just the sound of my heart. Then something inside me remembered the small black panic button hidden beneath the underside of the desk. My palm hit the corner hard. A single click echoed. Outside the door, an alarm switched on silently. A signal raced toward the military police desk on the other side of the base. He did not notice. He thought he owned the room. My vision turned black around the edges. My ears rang like artillery at close range. I felt the world tilting. The last thing I seen was the lens of the camera glinting from the shelf, recording every second of his hands tightening around my throat. My chest convulsed. My pulse went from pounding to fading. Everything turned weightless. For a moment I thought of nothing. No uniform, no base, no rank. Only the belt. Only his breath in my ear. Then there was a distant sound, the thud of boots running. A voice through the intercom, the hallway alarm light flashing red. He turned his head slightly. That gave me 1 second. My body fought for air. The edges of my vision collapsed inward. The fluorescent light broke into shards of white. I do not know if I screamed. I remember the metallic taste in my mouth. I remember my knees giving out as the door behind him crashed open. Military police voices roared commands. His hands froze for 1/2 second. My heart stuttered once, twice, then Nothing. I remember floating in a strange calm, a quiet black ocean where no sound existed. My mind detached. If death had a sound, it was silence. And then I heard someone shouting my name from far away. Sloane, Sloane. It was a voice I did not recognize, but it was real. Hands pulled him off me. The belt loosened. My body hit the floor hard. Someone pressed their hands against my chest. A rush of air tore into my lungs like fire. I gasped as if I had been underwater for too long. The world slammed back into focus. Fluorescent light, shouting, a boot kicking the belt across the floor, the cold tile against my cheek, the sound of my heartbeat stumbling back to life. I opened my eyes just enough to see him pinned to the ground. His face was pale now, the arrogance gone. All I could do was breathe ragged air and stare at the ceiling. My throat burned, my body shook in waves, but I was alive, and the camera had seen everything. If you have ever been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect you, let me know where you are watching from. I was 9 when Richard Kane entered our house, and everything that felt like home slowly began to shrink. My father's uniform still hung in the hallway, back then pressed and perfect, the last thing my mother never packed away. After he died, she folded everything else, but not that uniform. Richard walked through the door like a man stepping into a place he already owned. He did not raise his voice often, he never needed to. He spoke in the kind of tone that made walls bend. He told my mother what to cook, what to say, when to breathe, and she called it keeping the peace. I learned early that silence became a currency in our home. If I stayed quiet long enough, the storm might pass. He liked to talk about control. He liked to remind me that nothing in that house belonged to me, not even the air I breathed. He never hit me when anyone else was around. He never needed to. He used smaller, sharper ways. If I wanted to go out with friends, he said no. If I wanted to talk to someone about him, he called it disrespect. He made every choice sound like my failure. When I turned 13, he started using my father's name as a weapon. "Your daddy isn't coming back to protect you," he would say while standing too close, his breath heavy with beer. My mother, Vivian, never told him to stop. She would fold her hands in her lap and whisper that I should just keep the peace. I stopped expecting rescue. I started building walls inside my head instead. By 16, I had learned to disappear in plain sight. I knew which floorboards creaked, which cabinet doors made noise. He could track me by sound and smell like a wolf. The day I decided to leave did not come all at once. It built slowly through years of being told what I could not be. In my senior year of high school, a recruiter visited our classroom. I remember his uniform. It was crisp, the seams sharp like steel. He spoke about discipline, about belonging to something bigger than the place that hurt you. That night, I lay awake listening to Richard and my mother argue about nothing that mattered, and something inside me shifted. I realized I could not breathe in that house another year. On my 17th birthday, I walked into the recruiting office. I signed the papers. The staff sergeant behind the desk looked at me as if I had already stepped into another life. I did not tell Richard. I did not tell my mother. I packed quietly and waited for the bus to take me to basic training. When Richard found out, he called me ungrateful. He told my mother that I would crawl back when the world chewed me up. But the Army was not a punishment for me. It was oxygen. March 2012, Fort Jackson. The first morning of basic training was the first morning I ever woke up without fear of footsteps in the hallway. The drill sergeants yelled. The barracks smelled of sweat and starch, and still it was the freest I had ever felt. Every mile I ran, every order I followed, every time I lifted my chin and answered with a strong, "Yes." Sergeant felt like I was scraping his voice out of my head. But Richard did not disappear just because I put on a uniform. He showed up again during holidays. He would lean in the doorway of my childhood kitchen when I came home in uniform and tell me I was playing soldier. My mother would whisper that I should not start trouble. He would smirk when she said that. When I got promoted to E5, he said it did not matter because I was still nothing to him. When I bought my first car with my own money, he said I only got it because the Army felt sorry for me. Every victory I had, he tried to shrink. The uniform that made me feel strong only made him angrier. He liked to remind me of who I used to be. He would say things like, "I remember when you flinched at a slammed door just to see if I still would." I learned not to give him the satisfaction. I learned to build a different kind of silence, a silence that did not mean surrender, a silence that meant planning. In 20, I was stationed at Fort Liberty. By then, I had learned how to lead others, how to make decisions under pressure, how to be the person others counted on. But even as I carried rank on my shoulders, I carried the echo of that house in my chest. He still called sometimes. He left messages dripping with that same condescension. He showed up during family events with his quiet cruelty. My mother still whispered, "Keep the peace." She could not see that the only thing keeping him powerful was her silence. By 2024, the space between who I was in uniform and who I became around him had grown into a canyon. I was respected on base. I trained soldiers. I gave briefings. I wrote reports. I stood straight. But the moment he stepped into a room, every muscle in my body remembered the years I spent shrinking. It was a reflex carved into me before I could defend myself. I told myself it was in the past. I told myself I was stronger now. But I knew. People like Richard do not fade away. They wait for doors to crack open again. And when they do, they step inside like they never left. I felt it building in the quiet way storms build over warm soil. He still had access to my mother. My mother still had access to me. One day, I thought he will try to cross the line again. I had spent years learning how to fight wars on foreign soil. I never thought the real battle would begin back where it all started. When I returned to Fort Liberty in September, it felt like stepping onto ground I had spent half my life memorizing. The base smelled the same way it had 13 years earlier, a mix of diesel rain and starch. The wide concrete roads looked unchanged, the flag at the entrance still snapped in the same wind. I wore my uniform with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent more than a decade building a career, brick by brick. Staff Sergeant Carter, Administrative Operations, Command Office. It was not a glamorous posting, but it was mine. I had earned it with years of deployments, long nights, and enough after-action reports to fill a warehouse. The command office was my space. It had structure, order, clear lines of authority, which is why the moment my mother called, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. She had not called to talk in any meaningful way for years. The last real conversation between us had ended with silence and a slammed door. Her voice on the line was light, almost cheerful, like the years between us had not been carved out by her silence. She said she wanted to fix things, that family should not stay broken forever. I listened because discipline taught me to let people speak before making judgments. But the moment she said his name, I knew. Richard Kane. The man who had haunted every stage of my life. She said he was different now, that he wanted to make peace, that he just wanted to visit the base and see me. Richard visiting Fort Liberty was not a casual thing. Civilians did not just walk onto military installations, but family access existed. If a sponsor filled out the paperwork, if the visitor cleared the background checks, if they passed through the gate with a valid pass, they could walk in. I had seen it 100 times with spouses, parents, relatives. A small loophole built into a fortress. She had filed the sponsorship without asking me. The pass had been approved. He was already cleared. I kept my face blank the way soldiers do when the ground shifts under their feet. I thanked her. I told her I was busy. I hung up and sat at my desk staring at the security bulletin pinned to the wall. In the corner of the page was the visitor access section. Everything about it was real. No breach of logic. No procedural violation. He was coming whether I liked it or not. The first time he showed up, it was a quiet Thursday. I was leaving the command office with a stack of reports tucked under my arm when I saw him standing at the edge of the parking lot. He leaned against the hood of his truck like it was a front porch, hands in his jacket pockets, the visitor badge clipped to his collar. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me with that crooked smile I remembered too well. Then he called out, "You've got the uniform now, but you're still just that scared little girl." He said it like he was giving me a fact, not a threat, not a joke, just truth in his mind. I kept walking. I did not look back. That is what discipline does. But I felt it. The way his presence sank into the air like a stain. He began to show up often. Not enough to break any rule, but enough to let me know he was watching. A coffee shop near the main gate, the PX parking lot, the visitor waiting area at the administrative building. Always leaning against something, always wearing that smirk. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he didn't. But when he did, it was the same language he had always used. You think this uniform makes you somebody? It doesn't. It never will. Or soldiers are still just kids playing dress-up. You'll always come back home. I reported nothing. I logged everything. Dates, times, locations. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself he could not hurt me here. This was a base, a secure installation. He was just a visitor. But I also knew the small spaces where people could slip through. A visitor pass was a key. It didn't open every door, but it opened enough. The worst part wasn't seeing him. It was how fast my body remembered. The way my shoulders tightened when I heard his voice. The way my stomach clenched when I saw that visitor badge. The way years of distance folded into nothing. The way the soldier in me warred with the child he had made small. One evening, I found him sitting on a bench near the admin building, a cup of coffee in his hand, like he had been there for hours. I approached because ignoring him wasn't working. I told him he wasn't welcome here. I kept my voice level steady clipped, like the reports I wrote. He laughed. He tilted his head back and said, "Relax, Sergeant. I'm just here visiting family. The Army says I can. What are you going to do?" "Salute me!" His laughter echoed off the concrete walls. He knew exactly what he was doing. I went home that night and stared at the file cabinet in my living room. Inside were years of training records, commendations, deployments, proof of everything I had built. But none of it felt like armor. All it took was one man with a laminated visitor pass to drag the past into the present. I told myself it would not get worse. But deep down, I knew better. People like Richard do not just visit. They orbit. They wait. They look for cracks. And my mother had just handed him the key to mine. The night it truly split open didn't start like a war. It started like a family dinner. A long table, a clutter of cheap silverware, soft laughter, the low hum of country music playing from a radio mounted above the bar in a small restaurant on the edge of Fayetteville. I'd come because my mother said it would be just a few relatives, nothing serious. She said Richard wanted to make peace, that after all these years, we should sit down like a family again. Against my better judgment, I went. I wore civilian clothes, but I walked in with the posture of a soldier. My spine stayed straight even when my stomach twisted. Richard was already there when I arrived, sitting at the far end of the table with his arms stretched across the back of his chair like a king on his throne. His beer glass was half empty. His smile was too familiar. My mother sat next to him, her hands folded tightly on her lap like she was bracing for a storm she would never name. Around them were cousins I hadn't seen in years, people who still thought of him as the charming stepfather, the man who helped raise me after my dad died. They didn't see the rot underneath. The dinner started polite. The usual family noise, safe subjects work, weather-vague questions about deployments. I answered them the way soldiers answer questions from people who don't understand the weight behind the words. Simple, straight, no detail. Richard let me speak for a while before leaning back in his chair and raising his voice just enough to take command of the room. "All that uniform means nothing," he said, his eyes fixed on me with the cold amusement of a predator playing with its food. "You're still just a broken little girl." The table fell silent like someone had cut a wire. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him, letting the words hang in the air. One of my cousins cleared his throat nervously. Another shifted in her seat. My mother looked down at her hands. She didn't say a word. She never did. I felt that old heat crawl up my neck. It wasn't just the insult. It was the way everyone waited to see if I'd react like I used to. Like the kid who shrank back, who kept the peace, who swallowed the words because no one would step in. I said nothing. But in my head, another night unfolded. I was 16 again, standing in the narrow hallway of our old house. Richard's hand was twisted in the collar of my sweatshirt, pulling me against the wall. The light above us flickered just like the command office light would years later. My mother stood a few feet away, holding a laundry basket. She didn't scream. She didn't tell him to stop. She just whispered, Richard, please, like a line from a play she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. He squeezed harder. My feet barely touched the floor. My mother turned away. That was the moment I learned the most dangerous kind of cruelty wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was watching someone who's supposed to love you decide that silence is easier than protecting you. Back in the restaurant, Richard tilted his head like he was waiting for my reaction. I didn't give him one. I lifted my glass of water and drank slowly, but the silence he created wasn't like the old days. This one didn't shrink me. It sharpened me. My mother finally spoke, but not to him. Not to me either. She murmured something about dessert, about how it was getting late. She tried to pivot to smooth the table like she always did. That was her role, her way of pretending nothing had happened. But something had. A hairline fracture that had been there for years widened into something permanent. Richard laughed softly and leaned closer, his words low but clear enough for me to hear. "Look at you, all grown up but still alone. You think that rank makes you untouchable. It doesn't. You'll always be mine to break." I set the glass down carefully so it wouldn't shatter. I could hear the sound of my pulse in my ears, the same sound I'd hear a week later in the command office. It wasn't fear. It was something colder. I had spent years training to face enemies in uniform, but the enemy sitting across from me wore my last name. I glanced at my mother then. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were on her plate like the story on the table wasn't happening. I finally understood something I'd refused to name for years. Richard wasn't the only reason I'd spent my life walking on glass. It was her silence that built the house he ruled. It was her silence that let him sharpen his cruelty into a blade he could use whenever he wanted. The conversation around the table picked up again eventually. Someone joked about football. Someone else ordered another drink. The world tried to stitch itself back together, pretending the tear hadn't happened. But I didn't play along. I sat quietly and let the truth settle in my bones. I had spent years giving her the benefit of doubt, convincing myself she was just scared. But fear is not the same as innocence. She had made her choice long ago. When I walked out of that restaurant into the warm Fayetteville night, the air hit me like a gust from the past. The neon lights from the sign overhead reflected in the puddles on the pavement. I could hear Richard laughing behind me, not loud, just enough. My mother didn't follow. She never did. On the drive back to base, the road blurred into a long stretch of headlights and silence. I had been trained to recognize fractures in structures, the subtle signs that something was about to fail. And for years, I had ignored the cracks in my family. That night, I stopped pretending. That night, the fracture turned into a break. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and thought about how silence is not neutral. Silence picks a side. And hers had never been mine. 3 days before the night everything broke open, I stood in the command office alone, long after everyone else had gone home. The light above my desk hummed softly, the air still and familiar. I had spent 13 years learning how to operate within the structure of the Army, how to follow procedure, how to document everything, how to turn fear into data that could not be denied. That night, I wasn't just preparing to protect myself physically. I was building a wall of truth no one could bury under polite silence. I had already checked with the JAG guidelines earlier that week. It was legal to record within my workspace as long as I followed base policy and security clearance procedures. So I set everything up quietly, methodically, like prepping a mission. On the top shelf near the filing cabinets, I mounted a miniature camera no bigger than a quarter. It blended into the shadows between the training binders. From the angle I tested it, the entire front half of the office was visible. The door, the desk, the floor space. The audio recorder fit beneath my keyboard tray, its LED disabled. It would capture every breath, every word, every footstep. I tested the panic button under the desk twice until I felt the faint vibration in the wall panel, confirmation that the silent alarm reached the MP station 2 blocks away. My fingers moved steady even though my pulse quickened. This wasn't paranoia. This was strategy. I'd spent years pretending that if I stayed quiet long enough, he'd stay on the edges of my life. But the dinner in Fayetteville had burned away that lie. Richard wasn't going to fade. He was circling, waiting for me to stand still long enough to strike. I refused to let the past script the ending of this story. The following morning, I went through the CID reporting protocols for the third time in 2 days. I sat at my desk with the manual open highlighter in hand, tracing the steps like a soldier rehearsing drills. Document everything. Preserve chain of evidence. Ensure witness or recording where possible. Notify appropriate authority without escalating unnecessarily. I memorized the language like it was a weapon, because in this situation, it was. I didn't file an official complaint yet. Not because I didn't believe they'd take me seriously, but because I knew how Richard operated. He thrived in the cracks between certainty and doubt. If I moved too early, he'd find a way to slither around it, turn it into my word against his. I wasn't giving him that chance. I wanted something no one could argue with. A recording. His voice. His hands. His own cruelty stitched into evidence. That afternoon, I found David Chin sitting outside the admin building on the low concrete steps, eating a sandwich and squinting at the sun. He was one of the few people on base I trusted without reservation. We'd served on the same deployment years back, and he had a quiet way of listening that didn't demand anything. He looked up as I approached, the same calm in his eyes as always. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I haven't." I sat down beside him, the hard edge of the step digging into the back of my legs. For a few seconds, we just watched a pair of new recruits march by with their drill sergeant barking at them like a storm. Then I told him, not everything. Not the childhood details that still sat like rust beneath my skin. But enough. About Richard. About the visitor pass. About the way he kept showing up like a shadow attached to my name. David didn't interrupt. He didn't tell me to calm down or that it would all blow over. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and listened the way soldiers do when they recognize a familiar kind of darkness. When I finished, he nodded once. "People like him count on silence," he said. "They count on everyone pretending they didn't see it. But here we have something they can't hide from. Procedure. You follow it, you document everything, and the truth can't be buried." I felt something unclench in my chest when he said that. Not because it made me safe, but because it reminded me I wasn't walking into this alone. He asked if I wanted him to file something with CID preemptively. I shook my head. Not yet. I explained about the camera, the recorder, the silent alarm. His eyes flicked toward the building like he was already running the layout in his head. "Smart," he said quietly. "If he makes a move, they'll have everything they need." That night, I went back to my office and ran through my plan again like a soldier rehearsing breaching drills. Lock door, record, panic button, chain of evidence. I made sure the camera's angle caught the door perfectly. I checked the battery twice. I walked the length of the hallway outside the command office, noting where the MP response would come from, how long it might take them to get there. It wasn't fear driving me anymore. It was control. The memory of that night at the restaurant still burned behind my ribs. The way my mother's silence filled the room. The way Richard's voice slithered through the air like smoke. For years, I had been reacting to him. This time, I was going to set the ground. This time, I wasn't going to let him decide the rules. In the mirror that hung above the sink in the break room, I caught my own reflection on the way out. 31 years old. Staff sergeant. The lines of my uniform crisp, my hair pulled back tight, my jaw set the way it always did before something serious. I wasn't the girl he cornered in a hallway. I wasn't the woman he laughed at over a beer glass. I was something he could no longer control, and I intended to make sure that when he crossed the line, he'd do it on record. The following day, he showed up near the gate again. I saw him as I was walking out of the admin building, hands in his jacket pockets watching. He didn't speak this time. He didn't have to. His silence was a challenge. I walked past without slowing, without giving him the satisfaction of a glance. But my hand brushed against the badge at my chest, and my mind counted off the checklist again. Record, report, react. Back in the office, David came by and dropped a small folded note on my desk. Inside, in his neat block handwriting, were 6 words. If he tries, he's already lost. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my pocket. The weight of it wasn't much, but it steadied me. That night, the base was quiet. The sound of the flag outside snapping in the night wind came faint through the walls. I sat at my desk, staring at the glow of the monitor, the camera light hidden and silent above me. Every sound of the building settling, every flicker of the fluorescent bulbs sharpened my senses. Fear would have eaten me alive years ago. Now it was just part of the rhythm. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, but I knew it would. Richard was predictable in the most dangerous way. He wanted to prove to himself that the past still belonged to him. He wanted to prove that the rank on my chest meant nothing. And when that moment came, I was going to make sure the world saw exactly who he was. If you've ever had to fight alone type fight in the comments. The night it happened began like every other late shift I had pulled in that office. The corridors of the administrative building were quiet in a way that could make the air feel heavier. At 2037, the fluorescent lights above hummed with their usual tired rhythm, casting a sterile glow over the command office. The computer monitor washed the room in a faint blue tint, and the stack of reports on my desk felt endless. I liked it that way. The silence, the order. It was the kind of calm that made sense in a world where so much else didn't. But calm can be deceiving. I didn't hear him at first. What I heard was the soft metallic click of the lock on the door behind me sliding into place. That sound didn't belong. It carried the cold, deliberate weight of someone who knew exactly where I'd be. My skin tightened before I even turned around. I didn't have to see him to know. I smelled the bourbon, first sour and thick like it had soaked into his breath. When I finally turned, Richard was leaning against the door visitor badge hanging from his collar like a mockery of every rule on this base. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with the kind of cruelty that was never loud but always present. The air felt denser with him inside the room like it always had. He had been watching me. He had waited for this exact moment the night shift when the others had already gone home, when the corridors were empty, when the sound of boots was far enough away to make minutes matter. I pushed the chair back slowly, my pulse thudding in my ears. He smiled the same way he did when I was a child, that thin grin that said he thought he still owned me. "Nobody's coming," he said softly. "No one ever does." The space between us was small, maybe 15 feet. He closed it like a predator closing on prey that had nowhere else to run. His boots made no sound on the tile, only the faint rustle of fabric and the jingle of his belt buckle as his hand brushed against it. I kept my voice steady, even as adrenaline rose like a tide inside me. "You need to leave," I said. "Now." He laughed under his breath, leaning forward as if savoring the words. "Still pretending you've got power in this place. Still pretending that uniform makes you untouchable. You'll always be mine to break." He moved faster than I expected, one hand clamped around my wrist, jerking me off balance, the other shoving me back against the desk. My spine hit the edge, sharp pain blooming across my back. The smell of alcohol pressed against my face. His fingers dragged the leather of his belt free in one clean motion practiced almost casual. The sound it made as it slipped through the loops was low and mean. I twisted trying to break his grip, but he outweighed me. I could hear the fluorescent light buzz above us, the monitor behind me still glowing like nothing was happening. That quiet blue light made everything feel more surreal. My hand brushed against the underside of the desk. I could feel the small panic button with the edge of my palm. I needed time. The leather belt slid against my throat. Cold. Rough. Familiar in the worst way. His eyes didn't even look wild. They were calm, focused, like he had rehearsed this in his mind for years. He pulled it tighter, the buckle pressing into the side of my neck. "Die quietly," he hissed. The words cracked through the air like a gunshot. My lungs seized as the belt cut into my windpipe. Every sound in the room sharpened the hum of the light, the creak of the desk, the faint rustle of his jacket as he leaned closer. My pulse thundered against the inside of my skull. The world tunneled into fragments, the weight of his hands, the darkness tightening around the edges of my vision, the air slipping away grain by grain. I slammed my palm against the underside of the desk. One sharp click. Silent alarm triggered. A signal raced through the wires of the building toward the military police desk. He didn't notice. He thought he had all the time in the world. I clawed at the belt, feeling the rough leather bite into my fingers. His face hovered inches from mine, breath heavy with bourbon, a smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. "It's just you and me now," he whispered. My legs kicked against the floor boots, scraping uselessly against tile. My heart pounded, then stumbled, then faltered. The light above blurred into a streak. My ears filled with a roaring static. I felt my body begin to drift toward that edge where pain turns into nothingness. I had been in danger before convoy ambushes, close calls overseas, but this was different. This was the face of the man who had spent my entire life trying to convince me I didn't matter. Then I heard it, the first faint echo of boots on the hallway floor outside. It was distant, but it was real. A sound cutting through the fog. His grip tightened like he felt it too. I could feel my pulse fading beneath the pressure. My vision tunneled completely now, everything except his face and that light disappearing into black. My body sagged. My brain screamed for air. I forced my hand down to the panic button again, even though it was already pressed. A pathetic instinct to keep fighting. The edges of the room flickered like a dying bulb. Then came the crash. The sound of boots pounding outside the door, the alarm light above the entrance flashing red. Richard turned his head slightly toward the sound, just enough for his grip to loosen by a fraction. I inhaled half a breath through the smallest opening in the belt. It burned like fire down my throat. The door burst open. Military police voices filled the room in sharp commands. "Get on the ground! Drop it now!" Richard spun, still gripping the belt, but that 1 second was enough. One officer tackled him hard from the side. Another yanked the belt from his hands as they both went down. The leather snapped loose from my throat, and the air rushed back like a tidal wave. My knees gave out. I hit the floor on my side, coughing, gasping, the sound violent and raw. The room exploded into motion. Someone shouted, "She's not breathing right!" I could hear radio chatter, the thud of boots, the scrape of metal. Hands rolled me onto my back. A flashlight shone in my eyes, too bright. Someone pressed 2 fingers against my neck. Someone else shouted AED. The black at the edges of my vision pulled me downward heavy, but the world was still there. I could feel the cold tile under my cheek. I could see the belt lying on the floor a few feet away. And I saw his face. Richard's face pinned to the ground, his mouth twisted, his eyes no longer in control. Then my heart stuttered once, twice, then nothing. Everything went silent. The ceiling light fractured into a distant blur. I floated somewhere above the room, weightless, a strange, cold calm swallowing the panic. Voices came from far away, tinny and warped. Someone shouted my name, but it sounded like it came through water. Then the shock hit. My body jerked as the AED pads discharged. A wave of pain rolled through me, brutal and alive. Air tore into my lungs like knives. My chest heaved. Someone counted. "We've got a pulse." The world slammed back into place. The tile was cold. The lights were too bright. My throat burned like fire. My ears rang with the echo of his words. "Die quietly." But I hadn't. As they loaded me onto the stretcher, my eyes caught the small camera on the shelf above the filing cabinet. Its tiny red indicator was still on. Every second of what he'd done was there. Every word, every sound. His arrogance had walked straight into evidence he couldn't erase. The last thing I saw as they wheeled me out was him, cuffed face down with an MP's knee between his shoulder blades. All the years he thought he owned my silence had ended in one recorded moment. The moment the door burst open, the world shifted from silence to a blur of shouting and movement. Military police flooded the command office like a surge of controlled chaos. 2 officers were on Richard before he had time to process what was happening. His body hit the tile hard. One officer pinned his arms behind his back, while another ripped the belt from his hands and threw it across the floor. I was on my side, gasping, my throat screaming for air that wouldn't come fast enough. The red light above the door pulsed, washing everything in a rhythmic flash that made the scene look like it was trapped between seconds. Someone dropped to their knees beside me, a hand pressed against my neck, searching for a pulse. "She's fading," someone said. The words barely reached me. My chest convulsed. Air slipped in thin and ragged. My heartbeat stuttered in my ears. I could see Richard's face as they cuffed him. His expression wasn't rage, it was shock. For once, he wasn't in control. 2 medics arrived seconds later, their boots pounding against the floor. One slid a bag valve mask over my mouth, forcing oxygen into my lungs. Another attached the AED pads to my chest with brisk precision. My vision narrowed again, the edges of the room pulling back like a tide. The medic's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. "No pulse. Start compressions." My body jerked with the first set of chest compressions. It was a strange, distant sensation, like the world was happening a few feet away from me. The rhythm of the compressions was relentless, a drumbeat against my sternum. I could hear someone counting. I could hear the AED charging. Then a command. "Clear." The jolt hit me like a hammer. For a split second, nothing. Then the world crashed back in. My lungs seized, then pulled in a massive gulp of air that burned all the way down. I coughed, choking the sound wet and desperate. Someone shouted, "We've got her!" The MPs dragged Richard out of the office. His hands cuffed his head, pressed down. He twisted once, trying to look back, but the officer behind him forced him forward. For the first time, his voice didn't sound like command. It sounded small. The medics lifted me carefully onto a stretcher. The fluorescent light above flickered as if the room itself was exhaling after holding its breath. I stared up at the ceiling, my throat raw, my chest throbbing in time with my heartbeat that had only moments ago stopped. My ears caught fragments of radio chatter as we moved down the hallway. "Female Soldier 31 cardiac arrest pulse restored after AED shock. En route to infirmary, ETA 5 minutes. The ride to the base infirmary blurred together. I remember the rattle of the gurney wheels, the harsh brightness of the hallway lights, the sharp scent of disinfectant. I remember gripping the edge of the stretcher with one hand because it anchored me to something real. I remember a medic's voice beside me, steady but urgent. "Stay with me, Sergeant. Keep your eyes on me." "That's it. You're okay." Inside the infirmary, the pace intensified. They slid me onto a hospital bed, hooked me to monitors, inserted an IV, adjusted oxygen levels. The machine beside me beeped in quick, steady bursts, each one proof that my heart was beating again. A nurse checked the bruises around my throat, her gloved hands moving gently but efficiently. A doctor leaned over me, speaking in clipped phrases. "Cardiac arrest. 7 seconds flatline. Stabilized. We're transferring to Womack for observation." I barely registered the movement as they prepped me for transport again. What I do remember clearly is the glass door outside the emergency bay. My mother was there. Her hands were pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she cried. But she didn't come inside. She didn't shout his name. She didn't reach for me. She just stood outside exactly the way she always had, watching, not acting. Her silence was almost louder than the sirens that followed. The ambulance ride to Womack Army Medical Center was a tunnel of sound and flashing light. The medic riding beside me adjusted the oxygen mask, checked the monitors, and asked me questions to keep me awake. My voice was a rasp when I answered, but I answered. My throat felt like someone had dragged glass across it. My chest still ached where the compressions had forced my heart back to life. But I was alive. When we arrived, the sliding doors opened to a team already waiting. They moved me like a coordinated machine through the ER into a treatment room hooked to more machines' 4 lines, vitals monitors. A nurse wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm, while another placed a warm blanket across my shoulders. A doctor leaned in close and told me to focus on the sound of my own breathing. Outside the room, through the glass, I saw 2 CID agents in uniform speaking with MPs. Richard had been detained the moment they pulled him off me. The visitor pass that had once been a loophole was now part of a case file. A CID investigator held a small evidence bag containing the belt. Another agent had the office's recording device. I knew what was on it. His voice, His hands, his intent. One of the nurses said softly, "You're safe now." But safety was a strange word. I wasn't sure I believed in it anymore. Not in the way I used to. Hours blurred into fragments, my vitals stabilized, the pain in my chest dulled into a heavy ache. They ran tests, scans, drew blood. A social worker came in at one point, gently explaining the process that would follow CID investigation statement's protective measures. I nodded, even though part of me was still back in that office on the floor, with the sound of his voice echoing like a stain in the air. Sometime close to midnight, a CID officer stepped into the room. She introduced herself, her tone calm and measured, the kind that belongs to people who've seen too many cases like mine. She told me Richard was in custody. She told me the recording had captured everything. She told me this wasn't going to get buried. When she left, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the oxygen mask fog slightly with each breath. My throat throbbed, my chest rose and fell, the monitors kept time. The world hadn't ended, but something inside me had shifted permanently. Out in the hallway, my mother's muffled sobs leaked through the door. She wasn't fighting for me. She wasn't fighting for him either. She was doing what she'd always done. Nothing. This time it wouldn't be enough to keep him safe. This time silence wasn't going to save anyone. CID had opened a formal investigation, and Richard Kane was no longer just a shadow from my past. He was a suspect in a federal assault case on a U.S. military installation. He had crossed a line he couldn't step back from. A week after the attack, I walked through the doors of United States Army Criminal Investigation Division headquarters at Fort Liberty with the kind of clarity that doesn't come from healing, but from seeing everything for what it really is. The bruises on my neck were fading into a dull brown, the medical tape on my chest was gone, and the panic that once lived under my skin was strangely silent. This time, I wasn't walking in as someone who had barely survived. I was walking in as a witness who had something no one could refute. A recording. His voice. His intent. The CID building was colder than I remembered. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the hum of fluorescent lights stretching overhead. I had been here before for other soldiers' investigations, harassment complaints, security breaches, stolen equipment. I had never imagined I'd be here because of my own family. But that's how control works. It lives close enough to wear your last name. 2 agents met me at the front desk and guided me to the briefing room. On the table lay evidence bags, the belt, his visitor badge, the copy of the audio and video recordings. A screen was mounted on the far wall, already set up. There were folders with my name on them, each one labeled Assault, Classified, Base Incident. Seeing my name stamped on a CID folder should have felt like a punch to the gut. Instead, it felt like a door finally opening. The agent leading the investigation, Special Agent Reynolds, had a calm and methodical way of speaking. She laid out the timeline of the night, the moment the door locked, the panic button activation, MP arrival, AED, recovery, Richard's arrest. Every second was backed by a camera frame, a timestamp, or a radio log. Nothing was speculation. Everything was fact. She asked me to recount everything again this time for the official transcript. I didn't stutter. I didn't shake. I told her about the click of the door, the smell of bourbon, the way he said those words like they were a promise he'd been holding on to for years. Die quietly. My voice didn't break when I said it. I watched her pen scratch across the page as she wrote the words down. After the interview, they brought me to the larger hall, the one used for security-related cases that required transparency. Because this was an incident involving an unauthorized assault on a military installation, the chain of command had decided to make the internal hearing semi-public. That meant a room full of officers, MPs, JAG representatives, and a few key civilians, including my mother. She had agreed to attend after CID subpoenaed her. I walked into that hall in uniform. The bruises were visible just above the collar, and I didn't bother to cover them with makeup. I wanted them seen. I wanted everyone to look at them and understand what silence costs. The room fell quiet when I entered. At the front, a large screen displayed the case number. To my right sat a line of military police officers who'd been first on scene. Across from them sat the JAG legal representatives. And near the back, sitting stiff with her hands knotted in her lap, was my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Special Agent Reynolds opened the session with a clean, steady voice. She laid out the facts again. Then she said the words I had been waiting to hear. "We are going to review the audio and video evidence from the command office on the night of the assault." The lights dimmed slightly as the screen came to life. A grainy but clear angle of the office appeared. Me at my desk, the door opening, him stepping inside. The silence in the room was absolute. No one shuffled. No one coughed. It was the kind of silence that presses down on your skin. They played the footage straight through, every second. Him locking the door. His smile. His voice. The belt sliding free. His hands closing around my throat. The panic button. My struggle. The MPs crashing through the door. Then came the audio. The moment. Die. Quietly. His voice ripped through the speakers like a blade. The entire room went still. Not just quiet still. You could hear the faint buzz of the projector, the soft clink of someone shifting a pin. I didn't turn to look at my mother at first. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of it. Her silence was no longer invisible. It was standing in the middle of that room, undeniable. Agent Reynolds paused the playback. She let the silence stretch. It wasn't for me. It was for everyone else to feel the rot that had been hiding behind the word family for years. When I finally turned, I saw my mother's face. She was staring at the table in front of her, hands twisted together, her shoulders shaking. But she didn't speak. She didn't say, "I didn't know." She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said nothing, the same way she had the night I was 16, the same way she had the night at the restaurant, the same way she always did. The commanding officer leaned forward slightly, his jaw set hard. His voice carried the kind of restrained fury that only soldiers who've seen too much can manage. A civilian used authorized access to assault an active duty staff sergeant inside a secured command office. He didn't just attack you, Sergeant Carter. He violated the integrity of this installation. The JAG representative followed with a cold, legal tone. "And we have recorded proof." His intent was clear. His words speak for themselves. My hands rested flat on the table in front of me. I didn't fidget. I didn't shrink. I just breathed. Slowly. Deliberately. The agent clicked to the final frame on the recording, Richard face-down cuffed MPs swarming. Then the footage cut out. Ms. Vivian Kane, Agent Reynolds, said, turning to my mother, "You were listed as the sponsoring family member for Mr. Richard Kane's visitor access. Do you have any statement to make at this time?" My mother's head lowered further. Her voice was barely audible. "No." Reynolds didn't push. She didn't need to. The silence said everything. When the lights came back on, the room was heavier than it had been going in. Every officer there had heard his voice. Every person in that room understood that this wasn't a family dispute. This was an act of violence against a soldier on base. A breach of trust. A line crossed. For the first time, I wasn't the only one carrying it. It wasn't trapped in my throat. It was out there in the open where his words couldn't hide anymore. The hearing concluded with the CID commander stating clearly, "All evidence will be submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office and JAG for criminal prosecution. The Army does not tolerate this kind of threat inside its gates." I walked out into the hallway alone, the echo of his voice still hanging in the air. But this time, it wasn't just mine to bear. It belonged to every person who heard it. It belonged to the record. When I stepped outside, the late September air was crisp against my throat. For the first time in a long time, breathing didn't feel like a war. If you believe silence protects no one, type truth in the comments. 2 months later, the case that had once lived in the shadows of my family played out under the brightest lights of a federal courtroom. Because Richard was a civilian and the assault had taken place on a secured military installation, the trial was a joint proceeding between the U.S. District Court and a military panel. On one side of the room sat uniformed personnel from United States Army Criminal Investigation Division and United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. On the other, a federal prosecutor and a civilian jury. I sat in the second row in uniform, my ribbons lined up over my chest, the faded bruise along my collarbone still faintly visible. I hadn't tried to hide it. It wasn't something to be hidden anymore. The courtroom was clinical and quiet. No ambient noise. No distractions. When the bailiff announced the start of the proceedings, everyone stood. Richard was led in through a side door, shackled at the wrists and ankles. Gone was the smirk that had lingered on his face all those nights outside the base gate. Gone was the quiet arrogance. He looked smaller in a beige jumpsuit than he ever had looming in a hallway, but I knew better than to mistake that for weakness. Men like him still believed they could twist narratives, bend sympathy, rewrite what had been recorded. Not this time. The prosecutor opened methodically, walking the jury through the facts. Visitor pass authorization, base entry logs, time of the assault, panic alarm activation, MP response, AED intervention. He spoke in the steady cadence of someone who knew the evidence was a wall no one could climb. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning to face the jury, the defendant did not simply assault a soldier. He intended to end her life on federal property. The defense attorney leaned on Richard's history, his age, his claim of emotional breakdown, but their arguments wilted against what came next. One by one, the prosecution brought in the military police who had stormed the command office that night. Each testified clearly and without hesitation. One described forcing the door open. Another described finding me unresponsive on the floor. A third described prying the belt out of Richard's hands, their words stacked together like bricks. Then came the medical testimony. A trauma physician from Womack Army Medical Center stepped up to the stand. She spoke clinically, no drama, no flourish. She experienced cardiac arrest, no pulse for approximately 7 seconds before resuscitation with an automated external defibrillator. If the military police had arrived even 30 seconds later, the outcome could have been fatal. Those words hung in the air slow and heavy. The prosecutor didn't need to embellish. He simply replayed the audio recording of Richard's voice saying those words, "Die quietly." The courtroom fell silent. The sound of that sentence was exactly as it had been the first time I heard it, slick and cold, like something sliding under a door. The jurors shifted in their seats. One woman pressed her hand to her throat without realizing it. The judge's face hardened. Richard's attorney tried to soften the blow, suggesting intoxication, emotional distress, an act without premeditation. But the prosecutor only played the segment again, this time paired with the time-stamped security footage. Richard stepping forward, belt tightening, me falling, panic button, the MPs bursting in. Every second aligned like gears in a clock. The legal language shifted after that. The words assault and battery faded into something sharper. Intent to kill. That was the center of the case. It wasn't just a moment of violence. It was a choice, a deliberate, calculated act. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand and sat tall. I had rehearsed my breathing with the trial coordinator. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady, controlled. I wasn't there to tremble. I wasn't there to look fragile. I was there to tell the truth. The prosecutor began softly walking me through my background, my service, my role in the command office. Then he asked about the night. I told them everything in the same calm tone I'd used during my CID interview. I told them about the sound of the door locking, the smell of bourbon, the way he said those words as if no one would ever come for me. I told them about hitting the panic button, about the way the world narrowed to the sound of my heart stumbling to a stop. The courtroom didn't make a sound. Even Richard, sitting just feet away, didn't look up. The defense attorney tried to shake me. He asked if maybe Richard was drunk, confused, if perhaps I misheard. But a woman who has clawed herself back from the edge of death doesn't mishear the words, "Die quietly." I looked him in the eye and said I heard exactly what he said. When I stepped down, I walked past Richard without looking at him. But I saw the way his jaw clenched, the flicker in his expression. He still didn't understand that the control he'd held for decades had been stripped away by a camera, a panic button, and the truth. Then came my mother. She walked to the stand with shaking hands clutching a handkerchief. Her hair was pinned neatly, her face pale. She said she wanted to make a statement. She said Richard had been drinking heavily for years, that he was troubled, that he never meant to hurt her like that. It was the same script she'd always followed, smooth over the edges, rewrite the ending. But this wasn't a kitchen table. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a courtroom, and no one here owed him silence. The prosecutor cross-examined her gently but precisely. Mrs. Kane, were you the one who sponsored his visitor access to the base? She nodded. Did you know about his history of threats toward your daughter? Her hands shook harder. I didn't think. He cut her off firm but controlled. Mrs. Kane, the night your daughter almost died, that access was granted because of your signature. Is that correct? She nodded again, tears streaking down her face. But there was no softening the facts. Her silence had been a door, and Richard had walked through it with a belt in his hand. When the jury left to deliberate, the room remained quiet. I sat at the same bench I had sat on for 2 months of depositions and hearings. My hands rested on my knees, palms down, breathing steady. No matter what they decided, the truth was already out. But deep down, I already knew which way this would go. They returned in less than 2 hours. The foreperson stood holding the slip of paper like it carried the weight of something that couldn't be undone. On the charge of attempted murder on federal property, the foreperson said we find the defendant Richard Kane guilty. He didn't react at first. No outburst, no collapse. Just a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the kind that happens when a man who's lived by control finally realizes it's gone. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, citing the premeditated nature of the act and explicit intent to kill. I heard the gavel strike. The sound was clean and final. My mother was still crying when they led him away. She didn't call my name. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just sat in the front row, clutching the handkerchief like it could hold her together. I walked out of that courthouse with my uniform collar brushing against the bruise he'd left behind, knowing that the weight I had carried for decades was no longer mine alone. It was written into court transcripts. It was entered into evidence. It was judged. Justice wasn't about feeling triumphant. It was about the quiet fact that his voice, his hands, his cruelty would never touch another moment of my life again. 3 months after the verdict, the first letter arrived. It came through official channels stamped and processed like any other piece of mail from a federal correctional facility. My name was printed neatly on the front, but the handwriting inside was his. Richard's handwriting. The same uneven scrawl that used to show up on birthday cards when I was a child. The same jagged letters on old notes he'd leave on the kitchen counter to remind me what rules I'd broken that day. Now it was written on lined paper with the prison's letterhead at the top. I didn't open it right away. It sat on the corner of my kitchen table for 3 days. When I finally did, the words were exactly what I expected. He wrote about regret, about how he'd lost control and never meant to hurt me. He said prison had given him time to think. He called himself family. He asked me to forgive him so he could find peace. I read it once slowly. Then I folded it in half, then in half again, until it was a small square that disappeared into the bottom drawer of my desk. Not burned, not torn up, just filed away. A piece of evidence, nothing more. 2 weeks later, my mother called. It had been months since she'd said more than a few words to me. I recognized her number but let it ring twice before picking up. Her voice sounded tired, thinner than I remembered. She said his name softly, as if it were still fragile enough to protect. She said he'd sent me a letter because he wanted to make amends. She said he was family. She said maybe I could consider dropping the civil suit, maybe show some compassion. He's family, she whispered again, like it was a spell that could pull everything back to how it was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I let the silence stretch between us, then said evenly, he stopped being family the moment he wrapped that belt around my neck. She didn't answer at first. I heard the quiet sound of her breath catch like she'd expected me to say something softer, something that would let her keep pretending the world she'd built still existed. But I wasn't going to give her that. The civil case had moved quickly after the criminal conviction. His visitor access had been revoked permanently. The house they'd shared, the house that used to be mine too long before he turned it into something else, was subject to asset forfeiture after the investigation uncovered unpaid debts and his violation of federal access agreements. The mortgage defaulted. The property was seized. Vivian had to move out. The neighbors who had spent years waving politely from their porches now whispered when she walked by. I didn't gloat. I didn't even watch. I had spent too many years watching her choose silence. Now I was learning how to live outside of it. More letters came from Richard, some longer, some shorter. They all said the same things in different words. Forgive me. I didn't mean it. I'm still your father. One even said, we both know you'll always be mine, as if the concrete walls around him had changed nothing. Those went straight to CID's evidence archive. I didn't respond to a single one. Then she tried again. My mother. This time, it wasn't a phone call. She showed up outside the base gate, the same gate Richard had once waited near like a shadow. She didn't try to come inside. She just stood on the other side of the fence holding a folder in her hands. When I approached, she looked smaller than I remembered, like time itself had taken pieces of her away. She started talking fast as if she could outrun the weight of what she was asking. She said Richard had nothing now. She said he'd begged for one last chance to see me. She said maybe if I showed compassion, people would see him differently, see her differently. I stood there in uniform, hands behind my back, my face a wall. He almost killed me, I said quietly. She flinched. He's still family. No, I said, he was family. Past tense. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. I had done that for too many years, excused her silence as weakness, pretended it didn't leave marks just as deep as his hands had. Silence is a choice, and she had made hers long ago. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing outside the gate with her folder and her excuses. I didn't look back. I had spent too much of my life looking back. That winter, she moved to another town to live with a distant cousin. We didn't speak again. The last of the legal proceedings wrapped up quietly. The property was sold. The civil judgment against Richard stripped away what little he had left. He would spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls. I would spend the rest of mine not owing him anything. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows justice. It isn't triumphant. It isn't loud. It's steady, like standing on solid ground after years of walking on glass. I stopped checking the mail for his letters after that. CID would forward anything relevant, and the rest went where it belonged, away from me. He could rot in silence, and for the first time, I wasn't carrying it with him. Some people romanticize forgiveness as if it's the only way to be free. But for me, freedom didn't look like opening that door again. It looked like closing it and walking away without explanation. 6 months after the trial, Fort Liberty didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like a place where life could move forward one steady step at a time. The bruises had long faded. The media stories had quieted down. Richard's name had become just a line in a court record and a warning inside CID's training briefings about what happens when silence is allowed to linger too long. But my name was something different now. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't a footnote. It was a survivor's name. I spent the first few months after the sentencing trying to relearn what quiet meant. The kind of quiet that wasn't dangerous. Waking up without scanning the parking lot for a shadow. Leaving work without checking the hallway twice. Learning to breathe without expecting footsteps behind me. Healing wasn't a straight line. Some days the panic came out of nowhere, but others more and more were steady. I started volunteering at the installation's domestic violence support program. At first, it was just a few hours a week, sorting resources, helping with intake. But the moment I sat in that room with other soldiers, women and men who had lived through their own private wars, I felt something click into place. I wasn't just a case file. I wasn't just someone who survived. I could be the voice I had needed years ago. With the compensation and legal settlement that came from the case, I made a choice. Instead of buying a house or a new car, like some suggested, I bought an old 2-story brick building on the edge of Fayetteville, a place I had once driven past every day without noticing. It used to be a bookstore. Now the sign out front reads, Fort Grace Project. Fort Grace wasn't designed to be flashy. It was warm, real. There's a kitchen with mismatched mugs, a room with couches that don't match but feel like home shelves stacked with resource manuals, legal pamphlets, and coffee. Someone always manages to keep warm. It became a place where soldiers who had nowhere to speak could speak. A place where silence wasn't mandatory anymore. I sat with 20-year-old privates who whispered their stories like confessions, afraid of not being believed. I sat with sergeants who carried scars where uniforms couldn't cover them. I looked them in the eyes and told them the thing no one ever told me when I was their age. This isn't your fault. You are not weak. You are not alone. Word spread faster than I expected. Soon, Fort Grace became more than just a building. It became a network. Soldiers, veterans, spouses, even a few civilians started coming in, some for help, some to offer it. The CID officers who had once stood over my stretcher at the command office now volunteered at workshops. A JAG attorney came once a month to explain rights and protections to anyone who needed them. Some nights I walked through those rooms after everyone had gone switching off the lights one by one. It felt different from the command office warmer alive. The air didn't carry danger anymore. It carried possibility. One evening, a young specialist came to me shaking after finally filing a report against her partner. She said she'd thought about running instead. She said she'd almost stayed silent. She said she'd seen my face on the bulletin board, the CID briefing about my case that now serves as training material for base security, and realized she didn't have to disappear to survive. She stayed. She fought back. That night after she left, I sat alone at the reception desk, the quiet hum of the building settling around me. I reached up and touched the faint scar on my neck, the one the doctor said would always be there. For months, it had been a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. But that night it didn't burn. It didn't tighten. It was just a line on my skin. Nothing more. I realized then that survival isn't just about not dying. It's about living on your own terms. It's about reclaiming spaces, building new ones, making sure no one else has to walk through the same silence you did. Outside, the flag at Fort Liberty still snapped in the night wind, just like it had on the night I almost didn't make it home. But now, when I looked at it, it didn't feel like a symbol of a place that failed me. It felt like a place I had helped change, even just a little. I locked the doors, turned off the last light, and stepped out into the cool night air. The scar on my neck didn't ache anymore. I traced it lightly with my fingers and smiled, not because the past was gone, but because it no longer owned me. Spring settled gently over Fort Liberty that year. The air carried the faint sweetness of new growth, the sharp winter wind replaced by something softer. The sun dipped low across the base, turning everything gold. The flag outside the command office caught the light, the fabric rippling against a sky washed in warm orange. I walked toward that building slowly, boots pressing into familiar pavement, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. There was a time when this building felt like a trap, when the walls held my worst night and the floor still carried the sound of my heart stopping. But now it was just a building. The ghosts didn't own it anymore. The command office door opened easily. No click, no lock, just a simple creak of metal on its hinges. Inside the space was bright cleaner than I remembered. The filing cabinet that once held my hidden camera now held training manuals. The desk had been replaced. The panic button was still there under the wood, but this time its presence didn't make my chest tighten. It reminded me of the night I fought back of the alarm that brought help when no one else ever had. I stood in the middle of that room and closed my eyes. For a second, I could still hear it, his voice, the belt sliding free, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. But the memory didn't have claws anymore. It was just a sound, a moment in time that no longer defined the present. I opened my eyes and the world around me didn't shrink like it once did. It expanded. The sunset spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. I walked over to the same spot where I had hit the ground that night. The tile was smooth beneath my boots, warm from the fading sun. I lowered my hand to my neck, fingers brushing the faint scar. It wasn't pain anymore. It was proof. This place tried to break me. I whispered to no one in particular, the words steady, but it's where I rebuilt myself. The words weren't for him. They weren't even for my mother. They were for me, for the version of myself who once believed survival meant staying quiet. I was still standing in the same place, but I was no longer the same woman. I was no longer trapped in his story. I was writing mine. Outside, a small group of younger soldiers passed by, laughing about something that had nothing to do with me. The sound made me smile. That's what life is supposed to sound like, ordinary, safe, unburdened. A year ago, I couldn't imagine feeling safe again. Now, I wasn't just safe. I was whole. Fort Grace was thriving. The soldiers who came through those doors brought their own stories, their own scars, their own quiet strength. Some cried, some raged. Some just sat and let the silence finally be their own. I saw pieces of myself in all of them. I saw what happens when you give people a space to speak, when silence stops being a prison. I walked out of the command office and stood on the steps watching the flag above me catch the last streaks of sunlight. The air brushed against my skin like a quiet promise. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I didn't need forgiveness. I didn't need closure from anyone else. I had built it with my own hands. For years, I thought strength meant enduring alone. Now I knew it meant something else. It meant standing in the same place where someone tried to destroy you and breathing freely anyway. It meant knowing that the past couldn't reach you unless you let it. As the sun dipped lower, I turned my face toward the wind and let out a slow breath. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of one that belonged entirely to me. If my story touched you, share one word that represents your strength. We're not alone.